I'm often reminded of a story about a young musician who was completely and utterly fed up. His musical engagements were dwindling, concerts scared the life out of him, and what's more, he'd just broken up with his girlfriend, or more specifically, she'd broken up with him. He was isolated and melancholy, and he had to do something, anything, just to stop himself from going completely mad. Here I am making my walk through the graveyard of All Saints Church in Martin. In the distance you can see sheep grazing, birds. Is that an owl? Wow. Whoa. Yeah, okay. I've just seen an owl. Sorry, owl. Wow. So, it's time to go in, out of the rain. Yes, if you haven't guessed it already, folks, that melancholy musician was me. And this was my first serious attempt at a YouTube video just over a year and a half ago. The camera work is incompetent, and there isn't really much drama in the commentary either, but my purpose for visiting All Saints Church in Martin was very clear. I wanted to see what the greatest organ piece ever composed sounded like on a tiny village church organ. This is a one-manual organ by Henry Bevington and Sons, who I believe installed an organ in St Martin in the Fields in London. It has one keyboard, just the one. Sometimes there are two in parish churches, but this one only has one manual. There's an open diapason, one of the most common organ stops, and it's these pipes here, a nice chunky, beefy sound. And so began the first of many thousands of references to the open diapason stop, which I've made in subsequent videos on this channel. My demonstration was quite basic, but you can see what I was trying to do. Travel to a church, show you the graveyard, show you a bit of the inside of the church, and then give an organ demo followed by performing a piece of music, which you'll hear in a minute. My camera work and my explanations were very primitive at this stage, but I don't think the performance was. Bach to Basics was the reason I decided to pursue YouTube seriously. When I filmed it, I had about 500 subscribers, but it took me over the golden 1,000, and now I have nearly 70,000, and just over that if you'd be kind enough to click on the subscribe button right now. I've always loved this church, so I decided to come back and pay my respects to it, even if just to show you the scenery on a sunny day. When I saw the organ again, nearly 2 years after recording it, I was surprised at just how small it was, seemingly incompatible with Bach's greatest organ work. But in another sense, this old Bevington organ is completely perfect for me to explain just how weird and wacky the most famous organ piece ever written really is. The Bevington organ has no multiple keyboards, array of stops, huge divisions, anything confusing like that which would distract us from the key elements of this piece. Toccata and Fugue is about 300 years old, roughly. Although, you know what, we've got no idea. Because there's no manuscript in the composer's handwriting. The earliest copy dates from something like the 1730s or 1740s, and it was made by a student of Bach's student. So there is no direct link to the composer. So how do we even know it was by Bach? What's more, it has so many eccentric features which seem to show no similarity to anything else in Bach's music. In some ways, it's been written wrong. It breaks the rules of traditional organ music. Take the very opening. What you're hearing sounds quite normal for organ music. You're accustomed to it. It sounds quite impressive, quite imposing, you can imagine, on a large organ. But it's actually wrong. What do I mean it's wrong? It's right, we all know it. Yes, but it seems to be written wrong. It doesn't follow normal principles. And it does something which I cannot find any evidence of in any of Bach's other music, certainly not his organ music. My hands are playing the same thing. They're both playing exactly the same notes, just an octave apart. It breaks the rules of counterpoint. Now, counterpoint is the way in which different voices weave around each other, never doing the same thing. It's the key form of composition in the Baroque era. Imagine a choir. Each singer sings something slightly different, and that all contributes to this masterpiece of a piece of music. However, in this piece, both hands start by playing exactly the same thing. If you look at another one of Bach's toccatas in D minor, he wrote 3 of them, look what happens. Both hands are playing at the same time, but they're not playing the same notes. They're actually playing intervals apart from each other. That's okay, but you can't play the same thing at the same time. You just can't do it. And I looked back earlier to Bach's hero, Dietrich Buxtehude, at his toccata in D minor. And like Bach's, it starts with a motif, a short tune, and then it repeats a bit lower. But both hands don't play it at exactly the same time. So the famous toccata and fugue in D minor opens with something very controversial in defiance of common practice of the time. But it gets even worse. That, my friends, is called an unprepared dissonance. Music is an alternation of discord and harmony, but when you have discord in Baroque music, it needs to be prepared in some way. You can't just slam down one note and then slam another down to make a massive rupturous discord, like in a horror film. You can't do that. It might sound absolutely fantastic, but at the time I'm sure it sounded extraordinarily strange. Imagine a huge pipe organ in the region which we now refer to as Germany, although of course at the time it didn't exist as that. But a huge pipe organ pumped by a few human beings, that gigantic diminished chord with a rumbling pedal note would be incredibly strenuous. To keep pumping through that, it uses so much wind, it's almost designed to exhaust the listener and the organ blower at the same time. Here is focus on effect and drama and even horror over normal compositional practice. So we have two extraordinary features in the very opening of this amazing piece of music. And listen to what happens next. Bach, or whoever has written this piece of music, goes off into a passage which is incredibly melodic and incredibly rhythmic. So much so that it sounds completely modern to our ears, doesn't it? It's no surprise that it's inspired so much film music, so much pop music, in particular so much progressive rock music. Keith Emerson never covered toccata and fugue in D minor, as far as I know, but it was ready-made for him. Baroque and roll at its finest. For a piece which is so adaptable, so fresh, so brilliant, you would expect that it would have been famous ever since it was first composed or written down, but no, that was not the case. J.S. Bach was considered really old-fashioned by the time he died in 1750, and loads of his music just faded away into obscurity. It wasn't even published. The Toccata and Fugue was no exception. In fact, it was only published in 1833 with the help of Felix Mendelssohn, who thought it was a splendid and fantastic piece of music. He performed it at concerts. You can see a concert program here, where it's listed at the very end, just before Mendelssohn's own improvisation. So we've learnt all about the weirdness of the toccata. But what about the fugue? Toccata comes from the Italian toccare, which means touch. Italians, feel free to correct me on my pronunciation. The fugue comes from the Latin fuga, which means flight or escape. So let's now turn to the fugue, and we turn to a different church altogether. As my YouTube experience progressed, I became slightly less wooden at delivering my commentaries, and I visited a church with an extraordinary legend attached to it, and I thought that that legend really lent itself to a performance of Bach's horrifying Toccata and Fugue. You join me, viewers, from the southern facade of one of Wiltshire's most haunting buildings. This is St Mary's Church in Odstock. The registers here go back to 1297, but the church is probably considerably older. It looks very calm and serene now, but this church has been the subject of controversy and local legend for more than 200 years. The churchyard holds a grave of interest, that of an old gypsy named Joshua Scamp. He was hanged in Salisbury, having been found guilty of stealing a horse, though in actual fact it was taken by his worthless son-in-law. For the sake of his daughter, Joshua accepted the blame and went to the scaffold. His grave has a rambling rose growing by the headstone. In memory of Joshua Scamp, who died 1st of April 1801, may his brave deed be remembered to his credit, here and hereafter. Because of his selfless action, Scamp became something of a martyr among the gypsy community, and apparently they would visit this church every year on the anniversary of his death, after drinking at the nearby Yew Tree pub. The vicar and the church wardens got very cross with this, apparently, and they decided to cut down the rose and lock the church. Now, according to local legend, the gypsies then put a curse on this building whereby anyone who locked it would be subject to an untimely death. So this door stayed very much open. Who knows how much of that is true, but I wouldn't want to be the one to lock it. A fugue is a musical structure which is like a complicated version of a canon or a round, like London's Burning or Frere Jacques. It starts with one little tune, and when one voice has finished with that tune, another plays it 5 notes higher, and the piece gradually grows to become epic in its proportions and mathematically perfect. You can imagine that making all of the parts fit together is extremely difficult to do, mind-boggling, but Johann Sebastian Bach was a master of writing fugues. Not just writing them, of sitting down and improvising them on the spot at the keyboard. In fact, there's a story that the old J.S. Bach was invited to the court of the young King Frederick the Great of Prussia, who was also a musician. And King Frederick wanted to trap Bach by giving him a fugue subject, that's the name of that opening tune, which was so complicated that it was technically impossible to make it into a fugue. He sat Bach down at his new Silbermann piano, a fresh invention, and he gave Bach this little tune and said, "Play me a fugue based on that." But Bach did it on the spot. But the fugue in D minor, the famous fugue, is another example of one of these pieces which is attributed to Johann Sebastian Bach. However, it appears to be wrong in places. It doesn't do what fugues should. If you don't like anything technical, please skip. But this part is very interesting. I told you that the second time you hear that tune, it comes in at an interval of 5 notes away from the original tune. Well, it doesn't here. It's 4 notes. Yes, I'm an immense geek. Sorry, sue me. But it's just wrong. Fugues never do that. They come in at an interval of 5 notes above or perhaps below. Never 4. It's not done. It results in a completely different mood to the music. The reason why it's 5 notes apart is to create the maximum contrast, to drive this fugue onwards, or to make it fly, as the original Latin would suggest. But in the famous fugue in D minor, the second tune comes in 4 notes above. It creates a more melancholy mood, which suggests the composer was more interested in expressing themselves rather than following compositional principles. But it does not stop there. I promise you'll get to listen to the full Toccata and Fugue in D minor in this video. Don't worry. But for now, can I show you something extraordinary? There! Did you see it? Good. I stopped playing with my hands and I started playing with my feet on their own. A pedal solo in the middle of a fugue, simply stating the fugue subject on its own, is unique. Organists watching, find me another one. It's not done. It's remarkable. It's almost as if the composer is saying, "Excuse me, this isn't the same as a piano. Organists play with their feet as well as their hands, and I'm going to make you notice it." It reminds me of another piece by J.S. Bach, which is a pedal exercise. I'm going to end with a full performance of Toccata and Fugue in D minor, split between these two churches. But do listen out for the very ending, because it's extraordinary. Extraordinarily melancholy. The composer makes no attempt at a cheerful ending. Normally you'd have a rousing, perfect cadence ending on a major chord, even in a minor key piece. But here, the fugue ends with bitter defeat. It's defeat which triumphs. And somehow it shows how this composer was feeling more than 3 centuries ago when he wrote this piece. And perhaps it brings us back to the beginning of today's video. A young and agitated musician. Perhaps Toccata and Fugue was an early work by J.S. Bach, a work of defiance. I do not have the firepower, the Hauptwerk, cymbal-sterns, trumpets, huge, mighty, roaring reeds, and array of organ departments. However, I do have a love of these small village church instruments, which show off the genius of this music more transparently than any other. If you've enjoyed this video so far, you might like to consider leaving a small donation to help me out on these travels. I did visit both churches again to get you better footage to enrich the final performance. But if you enjoy these films and you've learnt something today, do feel free to leave a small donation using my PayPal link underneath this video. If you look down there, you'll see the link which takes you to the Salisbury Organist donations page, and from there you can leave a small contribution if you'd like to. I would be so grateful for your support. As you know, it's really the key way in which I can continue to make these films. So thank you so much in advance for your help. So, back where we began. Back to the very beginnings of my YouTube adventures with Bach's Toccata in D minor. At this point, everybody watching, if you haven't done so already, please click on the subscribe button underneath this video. It does not cost you a penny, but you gain so much from subscribing. It ensures that you are one of the first to see my next video. And every subsequent video which will follow, you will be notified. And it also helps spread my work to a wider audience. So click on the subscribe button. Today we've been Bach to basics, but with your help, we can go Bach to the future. Thank you so much for watching.